the Queer Indonesia Archive, which is a digital archive of LGBTIQ history in Indonesia. Before COVID upturned everyone's lives, I was living in Indonesia for about 5 years. And since I've been back, I've kind of rejoined the HIV family in Australia and kind of have brought some of my passion for community history over to as a bit of an add-on to my work at NAPWA. I'm just going to share my screen. And as that loads up, I am joining from the Wurundjeri Wurrung lands here in Melbourne, and just want to pay my respects to elders past and present. Can everyone see that? Should be a fairly stark little warning up about the presentation. Just wanted to give people a bit of forewarning. I am obviously we're going over the material histories of people with HIV in Australia, and obviously there's going to be some mention of people who have passed, and um, also a very brief mention of assisted dying, just because of someone I do a bit of a focus on. So, uh, the Tracing Our Memories is the database that's been launched as of ASHM, the conference last, well, I think over a week ago now, down in Adelaide, and it was great to be there as part of the NAPWA team, and also to celebrate the 40th anniversary of decriminalisation in South Australia as well. And this database is developed as part of a wider project that NAPWA is doing at the moment, which I've called a memory audit. But kind of a fancy way of saying that we're just trying to take stock of the material history of the HIV response, people with HIV, and our communities in Australia. And this work has kind of come forward because we are at a crucial moment where there's a lot of vulnerability around the material history. A lot of our organizations are getting older. Um, a lot of our community members are getting older. And there is, a lot of states that are facing a lot of financial vulnerabilities for their organizations and programs. And so we kind of wanted to get a bit of a better picture of where we're at in terms of ensuring that our histories aren't lost, um, and kind of start thinking about what are some strategies where we can help other people in terms of other organizations, other people in terms of protecting these histories in the future. So a small part of that project has been the launch of this database. Um, so database is fairly dry sounding, and at a certain level it is, but what it is, or what it attempts to do, is be essentially a catalog in one place where you can look up where any materials about people with HIV in Australia, where they are located. So as a focus, to kind of keep this project contained, we've taken a pretty strict approach of trying to only focus on materials either made by, directly for, or that represent people with HIV in Australia. I think we were a bit concerned if we open it up to just be HIV in general, that kind of we would drown in an ocean of please wear a condom posters, of which there were many, many made over the decades. But I think for us, we really wanted to ensure that it was people with HIV at the center of this, and that were um, really kind of the core focus of what this database will let you access. Um, so at a, at the back end, it's fairly boring looking, but it's at this point, it lists over 180 different collections that are held at 35 different institutions across Australia. So those institutions include things like state libraries, art galleries, museums, but also community archives such as the Australian Queer Archives. Also includes a number of university libraries, and some digital repositories as well. Um, as an example of some of the materials, some of those 180 collections are quite small. This was a six photo collection of an artist known as Tracy Lee that was found in the Gosford Library collection. So, these are photos of her performing in the 1970s in Gosford. Um, Very much more glamorous version of 1970s Gosford than I had in my head, that's for sure. And then some of the collections are actually quite immense. So there's the Gay Waves radio collection. So it's from to my knowledge, it's every edition of Gay Waves that was ever broadcast in Australia has now been is recorded, and we've identified 91 different episodes that explicitly either have someone with HIV talking or it's directly concerning people with HIV. So, two examples is they have a speech by Paul Young at the inaugural meeting of what is now Positive Life New South Wales, and a report on the ACT Up Melbourne protests in 1990 in front of the old Treasury building. Some really amazing interviews in that collection. Another example is Pos Life New South Wales archives, which are currently held at the State Library of New South Wales. So this is 46 boxes of materials. That ranges from things like faxes back and forth, minutes of meetings. It also has a very impressive collection of newsletters and publications. I think my favorite from these ones was the newsletter of the Lizard Lounge Luncheon Club. Um, and I think also in there, Vicky Virus Views. Um, Nipple Whack's first newsletter, which I never knew Nipple Whack tried to do a newsletter at any point. But yeah, it's
Mm.
really great to see those pop up. Also have kind of these files and other organizations by PosLife. So, this is the one when Nipple Whack was forming, or support a Positive Youth, Positive Youth Run organization that was briefly active in the middle of the 90s in New South Wales. The largest collection that we've just added to the database is the Powerhouse Museum's AIDS Memorial Quilt Collection. So I think there's over 103 different quilts held by the Powerhouse Museum. Um, Thankfully, I think for the wider community, not only have they described the and digitized the quilt panels themselves, but they've actually individually described each of the panels. So there's over 700 different individual listings there that allow you to see the panels firsthand, but also have a bit of they've often tried to give a bit of contextual information, also information about who created the panel where available. So obviously when we created something that looks like essentially a fancy Excel spreadsheet, we knew this isn't really something that is very useful to a lot of people. It's very wordy, it's a bit clunky. So we tried to design it so you can actually engage with the catalog in a bit of a different way than just looking at the spreadsheet itself. So there's the catalog itself. So instead of that kind of dry spreadsheet listing, It kind of gets everyone a bit of a file you can click on, and then you can kind of choose the types of materials that you're looking for. Are you looking for oral histories, or do you want to find where photos are held, where AIDS quilts are held, organizational documents, things like that. Um, but we also knew, like, maybe people don't necessarily know what they're looking for specifically. So we wanted to be able to try and make it so the database can be explored via a few different ways. So examples of this is like searching by organization. So we've taken a fairly broad view of organizations here. So organizations, groups, and clubs. So these range from really informal groups, sometimes just, groups of friends that kind of had a bit of a name, a kind of a name for the group for a while, all the way to like very formal, very funded, you know, currently still existing organizations like NAPWA itself, like ACON, like Health Equity Matters. Um, we also, and this is very much a work in progress, but we also really wanted to highlight people who were uh, represented in these collections. And I think an important thing to note is that this hasn't really been a judgment call on like who's important in history. This is about whose materials are currently held in institutions. So there's going to be lots of people here, you know, who are not in this list, who are really significant, who have done incredible things, who are a really important part of the history. Um, but because, their materials aren't currently held in a public institution, they're not showing up in these lists yet. So I think, yeah, take the people list with a bit of a grain of salt. It's very much a work in progress. And I think if especially people in this group, if you read through that list of people and you're like, oh my God, this person isn't there, do reach out to me because it's really useful to have those names so I can kind of do a specific search for them, see if I've missed them in existing collections. And then if I haven't, if they're just not around, then we can actually start thinking about, oh, why haven't they made it into these collections yet? Um, to give a bit of an example of how this might work and why I think it was important to approach it like this, I'm going to run through a bit of an overview of how Brian McGahan, I always feel like I'm ruining his last name, shows up in the database. So I'm, as I'm sure many of you might know, he was a social worker. He was a member of the Communist Party of Australia. He was former Mardi Gras president, and he was the alderman of the City of Sydney Council. He was diagnosed in 1984 and voluntarily chose to end his life in April of 1990. So if you were interested in looking for materials of Brian's life and you looked into the database, this is what would show up. Um, so I think he was a good example of showing how one person can be actually spread across quite a number of different institutions. So you have Brian's personal papers, which are held at the State Library in New South Wales. You have the memorial quilt panel that was made for him, which is held in the Powerhouse Museum. You have an interview with Don Baxter, which is held at the National Library of Australia that mentions him. You have interviews with him as part of that Gay Waves radio collection that's held at the National Film and Sound Archives. You have photos of him in the City of Sydney archives from the Sydney Star Observer collection. That's a very cute photo of his Mardi Gras parade float by Seymour Hardy there. And then you have things like this T-shirt for um, his campaign that's held at the Australian Queer Archives. And then, probably to his horror, his social work thesis from many, many years ago is held at the University of Sydney Archives. I would hate to imagine anyone reading my honours thesis. So, but these things um, are there for the viewing. Um, so I really felt like this was a really good way to have a look at why I think it was important to be able to search for people, just because it can be surprising actually how far-flung materials reflecting one person's life can be. And without something like this, you really would have to go to every single one of these institutions and search separately in their catalog to find it. Um, Same thing happens with if you look at different organizations. Um, you know, uh, spread across quite a number of institutions there. So State Library New South Wales, the National AIDS Archive at ANU, National Library of Australia, and then the Online AIDS Education Posters Collection. Um, so I think as a bit of a reflection of for me doing this work, some really substantial organizations are currently not in publicly accessible archival collections. So things like the Community Support Network, um, huge organizations with huge impact like ACON, Fawn Harbour Health, Bobby Goldsmith Foundation, Living Positive Victoria. Um, yeah. Uh, and then I think a bit more distressingly, some much smaller organizations that have been out of action for some time that aren't showing up in the records either. Support of Positive Youth from New South Wales, I mentioned earlier. Um, Body Positive, which was another New South Wales group that was active in the from 84 to 87. AZT Task Force, which was very much active in Melbourne uh, throughout the late 80s. The Positive Asian Young Child Group, which was the first Asian support group to be formed in Australia. Um, Another big question for the project is going to be huge amounts of interviews have been done with positive people in the name of research. Um, And after the life of those materials being used for that research, it actually gets quite tricky about whether those materials may be able to be accessed for future generations instead of kind of being locked up behind like um, ethical guidelines, barriers. And I think, yeah, it's a really tricky thing for us to try and think about in the future. Um, I'm wary of time, so I'm going to wrap it up there. And I've, uh, if people have any questions about the project itself or about, I guess, the more practical end of um, how kind of public archives and libraries and collections work, I'm more than happy um, to answer them. I'm also, I was very excited to see that through this project. We've uncovered a lot of early documentaries and video projects that were done in the late 80s and early 90s that we've been able to encourage institutions to digitize for the first time after what I had to go into the place to watch them on VHS tape, which was very much a novelty. But yeah, I think for me, it was really incredible to be able to see, a lot of people I've only had ever read about speaking in video for the first time. So I recently watched a great documentary that had Keith Harbour and Bill Hathaway. Um, in it that was all about HIV activism in the early 90s. There's another great one by Chris Carter, and another incredible one that was done by Positive Women Victoria, that I'm sure Bev might be able to share a little bit about as well. But yeah, I think it's going to be incredible, I think, for younger people to be able to access some of the incredible work that was done previously that's kind of not been accessible until quite recently.
Thank you, Bo.